Welcome back, everybody, to my fucking balcony. Yes, I'm back outside because it's, nice today. I hope the audio will, work. Well, we'll see. What I was going to say is we're talking about a book. Not a good book, but also nothing as bad as Wheel of Time today. I just finished The Hunger of the Gods by John Gwynne. And, I talked about the other one last year when it came out, so I figured I'll talk about the new one as well, see if it got any better. The answer is yes. So we're going to do this, and of course I took my horn and put some meat in for today's video, which is, the meat I made last year. I want to cheer today one of my patrons, and that is Charles from all the way from Quebec. Once again, thank you for being a Patreon backer, and well, this one's for you. Cheers. Or I should say skål. Alright, let's yeah, if you want to be cheered in one of my videos, please join the Patreon. I'd be very happy. Otherwise, if you're new here, welcome, and please, like, subscribe, maybe? I'd really appreciate that. I talk about books most of the time. Today, as I said, The Hunger of the Gods, which is part 2 of the Bloodsworn saga by John Gwynne. And those of you who, remember that I didn't like the first one that much. And I was debating with myself if I should actually go and talk, read the new one, or just give up on John Gwynne. And I figured I'll give him a second chance, we'll see how these things go, and that's what I did. So this is not like an actual review, because I don't review books, but I'll give you first, spoiler-free thoughts on the whole thing, and then we'll go and talk about the book that you should probably read if you enjoyed the first one. Alright, so yeah, it's still reenactment Viking reenactment fanfic with a lot of stuff. But he's certainly ramping up the tension and the magical abilities and stuff, which we kind of guessed after the first one, right? So yeah, if you like something very detailed on Vikings, or pseudo-Vikings, because it's a fantasy book, and, all the things connected with fighting, this one will be yours. If you're into dragons, maybe. If you're into other stuff, also maybe. As I said, if you like John Gwynne in general, and if you enjoyed the first one, The Shadow of the Gods, chances are you'll love this one. If you did not like the first one, chances are you still won't like this one either. So that's sort of like the review part of this. And I want to, look into some of the things that I thought about when I read this book, and why maybe I'm not the target audience, and also why I think some of the things are not good about this book. That's sort of the plan for today, and I guess we'll get started with all of that. So if you're worried about spoilers, this is where you should, go and read the book. It's not, well, it's sort of long-ish, I guess. Then we can talk about the rest. I'm not going to go too deeply into plot spoilers, however, so if you don't mind that much, or you think you can guess the plot lines already, then there's, also that part. Alright, let's talk about these things, shall we? Alright, so our main 3 viewpoint characters remain the same, right? We still have Orca, we still have Elvar, and we still have Varg, the surprisingly wolf-born kind of guy, right? We'll see. We've added more characters to the thing, so all of this expands. I mean, I don't know if this will be like a trilogy or more books than 3, but that's sort of like the thing we see. We expand the world a bit more in every way. We travel more, we go to different places, and we ramp up the magic. I mean, we ended with the freeing of that one god. We're adding a few more gods this time round. And yeah, we'll see where all of this is going in later books. So I was happy with part of that, and then I also was dissatisfied with it in a lot of ways. And I want to look at all of these aspects now and see why maybe some of the things could have been handled better and some worse and whatnot. So let's first look at prose. The prose has gotten slightly better. I remember last year I complained about how often John Gwynne resorts to, null bending and other like these words. He does the same here. So if you get annoyed by the use of like Viking words, God's my German accent's bad today. If you get annoyed by him using all those like specific terms, then you'll still be annoyed by it. I think he kind of toned it down on some of them, but only on some of them. The prose is still very, very detailed when it comes to armor, and that's sort of like my big issue with it. It's like I don't care that much, which I guess is one of the reasons why I'm not not the target audience for this. If you're into like really a lot of details, this still will work. There is another thing, however, that I personally found problematic with it, and that is the use of the magic tongue, right? So there's a lot more magic, and everyone is always using that old tongue, and I didn't double check, but it sounds very much like Old Norse to me. By which I mean there's like words in there that I kind of get and understand, and I assume he's not just putting it in like straight up Norwegian or something like that. It sounds like Old Norse or pseudo Old Norse. And this is a general problem that we've spoken about before, and it just like is really bad with this book, right? Because there's a lot of magic, and every time we get like sentences, long like paragraphs of like an incomprehensible language, just so we get a magic effect afterwards. And I'm like, you could just like cut out all of that, because people won't understand it, and it doesn't add that much atmosphere to it after like the first time or so, right? Like there's specific situations where it may work, but putting in whole paragraphs of a made-up language just to prove that you've made up a language, or in this case possibly adopted one, or just like slightly twisted it still doesn't add to the reading experience, because it's basically gibberish to me. It's basically gibberish to me, that I'll just like, either if there's important information in there, the author afterwards has to go and give like a rough translation or something, or like at least the gist of it, so we know what he just wrote, or it's just gibberish. And you could just like cut out all of that, and then you'll probably save a couple of pages and create a smoother reading experience. And as I said, this is not just a John Gwynne problem. This is something that a lot of authors do. I obviously blame Tolkien for it, because he's the guy with the language fetish. But Tolkien doesn't do it that much, frankly. And this, I guess, is one of the big problems that I get with this book. In general, we go to that in a second, and that is imitation. So what do I mean by imitation here, right? John Gwynne is clearly going for a saga style here. He's trying to imitate or replicate or conjure up the atmosphere of a Norse saga. Which makes sense, because, it's all pseudo-Norse and whatnot. I get it. And he is trying real hard, and it doesn't fully work for me. Because, how to say that? If you, I feel the first problem here is that he's writing in English. Norse sagas are not written in English. They're obviously written in diverse Norse Scandinavian tongues, depending on what you got, what kind of sources you have. It might be Old Norse, might be Icelandic, might be, that kind of thing. And the problem is, so if you're imitating that, what you're imitating is already a translation, so you need to pick one. And our tendency in these cases, and I feel John Gwynne is doing something like that as well, is to go for like a 19th century translation. Or a, pseudo-archaic, because it transports that feeling that we have, that since this is a saga and it's old, right? It transports that, we connect that with stuff being older, being a bit more clunky, being a bit archaic in a lot of ways. You know what I mean? If you've read like one of the freer, older 19th century translations of, say, the Iliad or the Odyssey or something like that, you know exactly what I mean. And I feel that's a problem, because what we take at that point is not so much the actual story, the actual, what we replicate in that case. John Gwynne kind of replicates, and we'll talk about like if he succeeds or not in a second. But what we get there is we replicate an already romanticized image, because those translations of the 19th century mostly, they have like a romantic impetus to it. It's like, you know, the weird pseudo Norse rhyming scheme, so to speak, that someone like the alliterative rhyming scheme that someone like Richard Wagner uses when he's writing his the lyrics for his operas and stuff. And there is a political impetus behind that. That idea of creating Norse, or like building up a Norse mythology or a canon of Norse stories, and in a way, and use them for the slowly building national identities, or constructed national identities of, you know, Germany, parts of England, you know, as a counterweight to a more Christian side of things in a lot of ways. You know, that's sort of the problem there. It's like, and going for these kind of this kind of prose, this kind of language, in a way, is replicating that translation and not the original. Because how could it? I mean, you would have to read the original in the original language, which maybe John Gwynne can, I don't know. But to judge that, all of your readers would also need to be able to understand the original and not connect it to something like this. And this I feel is a huge problem with the book. It goes deeper, however, and that is, it doesn't work all the time, and John Gwynne doesn't go and, you know, does this with like no aberrations or anything. And that is where the second part kind of, why the whole like saga falls flat for me. So what do I mean? The combat. Now, this book is clearly a love letter to Norse combat and reenactment, and you can tell, of course, that John Gwynne knows exactly how to do that kind of stuff, because he has experience with reenactment fighting, and I have friends, I know people that do the same kind of thing, so, you know, it's very authentic. The problem is, you never get that in like a Norse saga. Like detailed descriptions on how weapons work, on how shields work, on how the combat is. It's super realistic. Most of it is stuff that, yes, you could totally replicate on a, you know, mock battlefield at Musgard, or like any of these other huge reenactment festivals in the north. You could totally do that. But yes, the sagas don't do that. They abstract about these kind of things. And that's where I feel it breaks down. We have these parts that go very much into, you know, saga style thing, like using old words for things. In this case, it's very much the word thought cage, right? Like the idea of translating head as thought cage. And I get it. It's sort of this idea to harken back to that saga style, where you sometimes have a specific translations for words, because you're talking like a mythic sort of way. That's the same thing as you have your like strong-armed, whatever kind of like epithets that you add to some characters in, say, Greek or Norse mythology, right? Those attributes and stuff like that. And I get why he's doing it, but like at this point, especially when you switch between like a hyper-realistic description of combat, including, you know, all these wonderful words for bits of the human body that you're normally not supposed to see because it's, you know, inside. And then you switch to something like that. I'm like, that's jarring. You talk about fucking anatomy in one moment, and then you call it thought cage in the next moment, and these two things don't match together that well. So that's where I feel it kind of gets jarring, because you're not doing something like, say, Susanna Clarke when she wrote, what's it called, Doctor Strange and Mr. Norrell, right? No, the other way around. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. That's the word, right? Doctor Strange. Right, but what we see there is exactly that. She's stuck completely to a 19th century vocabulary. John Gwynne isn't doing that. He's sometimes resorting to these archaic phrases and stuff that he's picked up from either translating sagas himself or reading these 19th century or like pseudo-archaic translations of the sagas. And then he jumps into hyper-realistic combat, and that just doesn't vibe well with me. And I get, pick a side, man. Pick a side. I don't mind having this story told in like ultra modern prose. That would be fun. Some of parts of it, at least. Plus, a lot of the story feels, and this is, I guess, where we're going next, is mostly where the story and world and stuff is going. And a lot of these stories, because I said it's a love letter to Viking reenactment fighting, a lot of the story feels like it is I don't know, just something that's holding together large combat scenes. You could really just like tick it off tick off the boxes. We have another one of those duels, a Holmganger. Yes, wonderful. We have another shield wall. Of course we do. We have combat on a ship. Yes, of course we do. We have, see, he literally goes through all the different options that you could see at, like, say, those, Viking reenactment tournaments and stuff like that, right? It's like duels, shield walls, all of these wonderful things that people do when they play at Vikinging, so to speak. And we kind of see, you can see the setups for those coming. It's like the set battle, the ambush, the duel, all of these things. The melee, we get all of those, and sometimes you can see them like a chapter or two ahead. You're like, I know where this is going, because we need another different sort of fight scene so we can, demonstrate our knowledge of how these things work. And then you go back and get like another training montage where new character, this time around it's like Liv and no longer Varg, although Varg is still getting training things. So we can also get some information on how to train martial arts and get all those details, those juicy details that John Gwynne definitely knows about, but that I personally, as a reader, don't need to know about, because I'm not training as a Viking reenactment guy right now. So I don't need to learn all these wonderful details on how these things work. We even have like the montage where Orca is taking her chainmail and putting it in a sack with sand to scour it. And yes, I know that that's how you clean chainmails, but do I need like a full-on explanation of that? Probably not. Alright, so let's turn to the next big thing here, why I think is room for improvement. That is just it may just be the problem of the audiobook. And I did not go back and reread or re-listen to Shadow of the Gods, but there's some inconsistencies. I'm like a 95% sure that in the first book, that short stabbing knife sword thing was called a sax. And this time around, it's always called a seax, which is a more archaic way of saying the same thing. And since that fucking weapon is used in like every other sentence, it kind of grated on me. It's like, this is an audiobook from a year ago, and the book is from a year ago, right? Why not go back and double check? Either stay consistent as a writer or stay consistent as a narrator. And at the end of the day, it's like, yes, maybe Siax is the better pronunciation, and I'm fine with that. But if for immersion's sake and all of these wonderful things, it would have been much better to just like stick with the other one, because outside from those like 5 ultra Viking nerds, no one cares. No one really knows the difference, right? I mean, so that's one of those things where I'm like, weird. It just grated on me. But this may literally be a problem of the audiobook, that if you have read the books, please let me know if it was consistent there. Another thing with inconsistencies, and there's a few of them, with the audiobook in general, it just felt cheaply done in a way. Like, the narrator is great, don't get me wrong, the narrator is fantastic, but there's like situations that may or may not be printing errors, where it's like, when he's saying like, that was a quick one, where it was like the river, something into the river, and it literally, I know from the scene that it's supposed to be the river mouth into a lake, and he reads river twice, and that may either be printing problem, like that it's an editing issue, or it's an audio reading problem that someone while editing the thing just didn't catch. And that's just like, I don't know. I feel bad for that kind of stuff because it gives it like it makes the whole thing come across as cheap, as someone who's not really caring about it, and that's always not a good thing. And then there's like an inconsistency that may or may not make a lot of like difference, or maybe just I don't know. So this one character is called Bragg Trollsbane when he's introduced the first time, and then later he's troll killer and troll slayer, and I'm like, could you settle on an epithet there? Because that's sort of the problem, right? You are, Orca is Skull Splitter. She's not Head Hacker or, Thought Cage Destroyer. No, she's always Skull Splitter. And why go with Troll's Bane and then switch it up? And I'm not saying, I mean, there's situations where someone is just turning it into Troll's Turd or something as, a way to insult the guy. But his friends, and when people are thinking about the guy, they change the name. And that feels just like, settle on one, because that's sort of how the saga aspect works. You have these repetitions in there, because that makes it easier to memorize when you're like performing this as a scold or whatever, in an oral tradition. So sticking with the same one would be much better than switching it up all the time. And that's an editing issue that I like. You need a really good reason as a writer to just push that past me as an editor. Not that I'm an editor, but you know what I mean. And that just like, once again, also made it feel rushed in a way. I mean, this is like 1 year after the first one. Literally 1 year. It's like, maybe take a little more time in the production and the finishing of this product. Because it is a product at the end of the day. And now let's look at the rest. So one big thing here in this book is, we have Easter today. Basically, what we do today is talk about the resurrection of a god. And John Gwynne just does it twice because he can better Christianity easily here. So we have a lot of like resurrecting the old gods and putting them on leashes and stuff. And this, I feel, is something that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Magic just exploded compared to the first book. The first book, like magic, was fairly low and like simple magic. Yes, you have the blood oath they swear and stuff like that, but no one's throwing around fireballs and shit in Shadow of the Gods. And I liked that because I like magic to be sort of realistic, and suddenly everyone is doing like rune magic and throwing around all this shit all the time, and I'm like, that's crazy. You're resurrecting gods. And I would have liked to have some sort of explanation if we're going to up the magic, which would be cool. I don't know, maybe it's because you freed the dragon, and thus magic is becoming more powerful or something. That would be, an explanation that would make sense. Instead, it just feels like suddenly we have like magic happening all the time, and more fireworksy kind of magic going down all the time. And I'm like, I don't know. Now let's look at a few final thoughts before I end this for today. And those are the expanding of the setting. We introduce more gods, more fallen gods, every god from all kinds of countries. We have that connection to what he's called Iskadan, which, I guess is sort of Byzantium. Sort of weirdly a mix of Byzantium and, sort of a Mongol or Hunnish empire, because we have also Khagans and stuff like that, but it feels more Byzantine in a lot of ways there, because it's the Emperor Kirill and shit like that. We go there and suddenly we also have animal gods there, and we have like a more tainted of different qualities. There's like a hawk god now, not only an eagle god. There's a bull god, like I guess something like a minotaur kind of thing. I assume there will be scorpion gods as well, because we see a statue of that. And in general, I'm fine with it. It just feels a bit like let's have like every sort of half animal, half human thing going down out there, and that makes the whole like like Ragnarok style of battle of the gods kind of feel irrelevant if suddenly everyone does it. It's no longer a specific culture. Suddenly, like the entire world is all about people having worshipped like giant animal shape-shifting gods, and now all of those gods are dead or slowly coming back, I guess. And yeah, it makes the cultures feel less different than, or like distinct than they could like actually feel, because at this point the only thing that separates them is the kind of armor they're wearing. And I'm like, all right, I know this is all about combat, but still, wouldn't it be nice if you have like a new sort of faith or any kind of thing? Because we're not doing anything with the whole like, if we have seen our gods die, how do we deal with that? It's a missed opportunity, I feel. But this book focuses so much on the combat stuff that we tend to ignore all the deeper themes that we could actually interpret in there. No characters. There's two new viewpoint characters, and I actually kind of almost like Guthwar, because yeah, he's an asshole. We knew that from the beginning, and there's still a lot of problems with his character, like the way he's written, and we talk about that in a second. But he's the only one who's trying to not solve everything by combat all the time, and this is like, I guess, my largest criticism of John Gwynne, and why I suspect this, like his writing in general, will not be for me no matter which book. Because of his focus on realistic combat, on reenactment combat, his plot often feels like a setup to have another cool battle scene, and violence is almost always the solution for every conflict. There's very little that is actually dealt with, like by dealing, making, arguments and stuff. No, everyone is forced to do stuff. You're either tortured or, forced to fight. And I'm like, it gets a bit boring after a while. So having a character like Guthwar be different, and actually his plotline be more about tactics and what he calls deep cunning, which is another one of those fallbacks to archaic language and stuff, is pretty, it's refreshing in a way. But now let's talk about the characters in general. They're all like one-trick ponies. Each and every one of them has like one driving emotion and nothing more. And yeah, I'm glad they have one driving emotion. That's more motive. That's way more than most of the Wheel of Time has got. But still, it's like, yeah, Orca wants her son back, and she'll do everything to do that. That's her driving motive. And nothing else comes in there. There's like very little else about that character, about like that thing. And Varg, he wants to find out who killed his sister, and but apart from that, it's all about like, I was a slave, I will no longer be a slave, and that's his one thing. And Elvar is like, I want to prove that I'm a human. It's not just because my father is like king and whatnot, not Jarl, but you know what I mean, right? And that's all she does. And Guthwar is, well, he's just like an asshole. He's like ambitious and sneaky and has like no morals and is egotistical all the way. And that's all he is as a character. And I'm like, maybe make it less in your face. And I mean, I can see the idea that if we're going back to sagas and mythology, that you want to have people like our main characters be the embodiment of specific characteristics, which is, how mythology works in a lot of ways. I can see that. But it just doesn't feel right, because we, on the other hand, we sweep over into this like super hyper realistic and sort of psychology and whatnot. It's like, no. if Guthwar is a sneak, then don't give me like all these like deeper insights into his psychology. No, he's evil because he's evil, and that's it. So it's once again half-hearted in a way, and that I feel is a huge problem with it. And yes, I know the whole thing is going about the idea of thralls and people being equal and don't treat them like lesser or anything like that. And I like the idea behind it, and I did really enjoy the story about the way of the world and the cynicism of the way of the world. It's like, no, the way of the world is what we make it because we can change and think. That one was a really good point. I just feel it kind of gets lost in the sheer excitement to have another weird combat where someone is, using their seax to split someone's thought cage. So yeah, let's wrap this up. It is once again, a very, very pedestrian book, I feel. It feels like someone has great ideas in there. The setting is still wonderfully cool. I love that. Um, but it feels plodding in that way. Yeah, I need another cool I need another cool combat sequence. So let's push our people somewhere. The overall plot, like how everyone is connected to the same kind of people, feels contrived in some areas, and the repetitions are just too much. A good editor could have cut out like things. There's a bit there where, like, we learn that when we have those children traveling with the Bloodsworn, the children they saved, right? We know Einar is looking after them because Einar is a really kind-hearted dude and whatnot. But we have like 3 or 4 separate times when we learn that the children are sitting in a wagon, and Einar is driving the wagon. And why do we need a paragraph about that like 3 times? We got it the first time round, man. It's fine. And that's what I mean when I say that there's too much repetition in here that doesn't really work well. Because either you make it like a full repetition to give that like weird like oral tradition kind of vibe to it, or you just leave it out. Because I can assume that from the beginning of the trip to the end of the trip, I now will drive that cart with the kids on it. So yeah, that's all of that. It's not as bad as, Shadow of the Gods, but it's still far from being like a fantastic read for me. And I just assume that I'm not the target audience for this. I'm looking for different things in books than the things that John Gwynne provides in his stories, I guess. Which, fair's fair. That's what it is. I hope I could still like enlighten you on why I think these things don't work for me, and I wish there would have been like more care taken about some of these inconsistencies that I mentioned, because that's just unnecessary. Anyway, hope you have a great Easter. Celebrate whatever, or Ramadan, or whatever you're celebrating this weekend and this week. See you about something cool tomorrow, I guess, hopefully. So yeah, Skål.